In the previous video, we discussed how Robert Bauval proved the layout of the Giza pyramids is identical to the layout of Orion's belt, and after long research in the pyramids' texts, he proves that even the placement of the River Nile simulates the Milky Way galaxy, and how the 7 pyramids extending from Abrawash to Dashur mirror the 7 stars in the sky. He published his discoveries in a scientific archaeological magazine. It was years later, in the early 90s after his theory was published, that everyone was able to have their own computer. Bauval purchased a program called Sky Globe. The program which astronomers used in order to know the location of the stars at any given time in history or in the future. This program, through certain calculations, was able to demonstrate the constellations and the changes in their locations due to the Earth's movement. In other words, you can see for yourself where the stars will be tomorrow or the next day, or even after 1,000 years. Through the Sky Globe program, Robert Bauval returned to the age the pyramids were supposed to be built approximately BC 2500, but he noticed something unusual. A note that made him wonder: did archaeologists misidentify the real age of the pyramids? Age of the pyramids. In the 60s, 2 researchers came up with an important theory. An Egyptologist named Alexander Badawi and an astronomer named Virginia Trimble. It is well known that the Great Pyramid has 4 shafts. They recognized that the 2 slots in the King's Chamber were pointing towards Al-Nitak, the biggest star in Orion's belt, as well as the Thuban star, while the 2 shafts in the Queen's Room are pointing towards Sirius and Polaris. What really matters is the shaft in the King's Room. By their calculations, they found that the star Al-Nitak passed across the King's Chamber shaft at around 2500 BC, which was one of the reasons the Great Pyramids were dated back to 2500 BC. We'll see how Bauval took advantage of this theory. The Sky Globe program is now outdated, but we will use a similar program to observe what grabbed his attention. The program we will use is Stellarium. It is free and available on all operating systems including Windows and Apple Mac. It can illustrate the sky and locations of stars within 100,000 years B.C. and A.C, and it's available in the links below this video if anyone wishes to try it out. When you use the program, first you should locate the location on Earth from which you'd like to view the stars. We'll select the Giza region where the Giza pyramids are located, but feel free to choose any spot in northern Egypt where the old capital Memphis was. Then you should insert the exact coordinates of longitude and latitude, which you can get from using Google Earth. Either way, the results will not differ much. Here from the list, we'll choose the Giza zone. Now it's like we are standing at the pyramids in 2019. Bear in mind that the program only shows the sky, not the land, so it won't show the pyramids. But they are supposed to be here. Now we'll look at south. The letter S stands for south. Now the constellations display within the southern part of the sky. These lines are made by the program for easier identification of the constellations. Let us go back to the year 2500 BC by writing 2500 with a negative sign in the date field. This was the sky at that time. We can move the days and months back and forth until Orion and the Milky Way appears in front of us. This is Orion, and this line is the Milky Way. The angle of the axis of the pyramids from the horizon is exactly 45 degrees, but Robert noticed that if we draw an imaginary line extending from the King's Chamber shaft as Trimble and Badawi proved, then we will find that the pyramid's layout does not correspond to Orion's belt. This means that the builders correlated the shafts of the Great Pyramid to Al-Nitak, but they didn't correlate the same with the other 2 pyramids. There's a big difference in the angles. If you zoom in, you'll find a clear tilt in the angulation. Down there is the layout of the Giza pyramid set at a 45 degrees angle from the horizon, as we acknowledged earlier, but the constellation of Orion is at an acute angle, which is a big difference. In other words, if the pyramids had been built in 2500 BC, they wouldn't have been set up like this, but they would have been built at an acute angle to correspond to Orion's belt. At this point, you may be wondering, what if they just built 3 pyramids at random angles and that's it? This is where we insist that ancient Egyptians made no mistakes and left nothing to chance, and nothing was randomly built. Everything was designed perfectly, and each angle they chose was for a specific reason. What happens if we decided to change the date a bit? Let's move the date forward to 2400 BC. Now we have even reached 2000 BC and still, there's no match in the layouts. Let's try to move backward in time. Say 2600 BC. Even 3000 BC, we have now gone as far back as 3500 B. See when the Egyptian civilization had supposedly begun in its known form, yet there's no match. But Robert noticed that the angle difference decreases as we go back in time, and this is when he started wondering whether the pyramids were properly dated. To answer this, he raised another question, how the Egyptian civilization and its start was dated, and he started looking for answers in books. Champollion, the one who established the rules for decoding hieroglyphs, suggested that the Egyptian civilization started at 5867 B. C started with the first dynasty. Later, the German archaeologist Karl Lepsius pushed the date to 3892 B.C. Then Auguste Mariette, the founder of the Egyptian Museum, moved it back again to 5004 B.C. His colleague Dr. Bruch then moved it to 4400 B.C. Eventually, it became 3200 B.C., the date that most scientists endorse nowadays as a date for the beginning of Egyptian civilization, when the two kingdoms were united by King Mene-Narmer and when the first dynasty began. The numbers and estimations were generally based on biblical texts that mention the ages, reigns of kings, and prophets. And most were personal estimations differing from one person to another. Up to this date, there is a huge contrast between theories and dates between references. This is why you sometimes find C or CA before dates in some books, as it represents circa, which means an approximation. This indicates that the date has been approximated and isn't exact, since there's no concrete evidence to rely on for the date. All are speculations and estimations, and every book is different. The real question here is, did the ancient Egyptians leave us any documents regarding the beginning of their civilization? In the Egyptian Museum in Turin, Italy, there is one of the most important papyrus texts. The Italian explorer Dravetti gained their acquisition in the 19th century. The papyrus is sadly shattered, and we are not sure whether this happened before or after its discovery. This papyrus includes the names of more than 340 Egyptian kings with their years of reign, beginning with a period called the Era of Gods, which extended as far as 7,000 years. Until this day, no one knows what's meant by the Era of Gods and what it represented. If this papyrus was whole, it would have been the most important papyrus in all of Egyptian history. Egyptologist Dr. Salim Hassan commented in his encyclopedia that this papyrus mentions several kings that we had known nothing about. Herodotus mentioned that according to the Egyptian priests, 340 kings reigned in Egypt in 11,340 years. Do you notice the duration? The other documents estimating the age of Egyptian civilization were established by Manetho, a highly educated Egyptian priest whom Ptolemy II asked to tab and date the history of ancient Egypt. Manetho used texts and registries from the templates as his references. The original Egyptian copy of Manetho's book was sadly lost in the Alexandrian library Grand Fire, which was in the Roman period. Luckily, some historians copied excerpts from Manetho's scripts. Some of the excerpts indicated that the tabbing and grouping of the Egyptian civilization doesn't end at 3000 BC but rather at almost 30,000 BC. Eusebius of Caesarea mentioned that according to Manetho there were three periods before the dynasties, which some people mistakenly refer to as the pharaohs. Those three periods are the demigods, Shemsuhor or Horus followers, and pre-dynastic kings, extending over a total of 28,000 years. Eusebius even doubted Manetho's storyline, claiming that he meant 28,000 months and not years. In another disclosure by the Sicilian historian Diodorus, he mentioned that according to Manetho, Egypt's history extends to more than 33,000 years before Menes. This means that according to Diodorus, the age of the Egyptian civilization extends to 36,000 BC. Other historians mention similar timelines, indicating that the date of the civilization exceeds tens of thousands of years. So if we look at the timeline of Egyptian history, starting with the birth of Christ, before that was the Roman period, and before was the Ptolemaic and the dynastic periods, and then before were different sets of communities scattered without a central government like Nakata, Badari, and others, and before this was supposedly the prehistoric period, which we know nothing about. Romans, Ptolemaic period, dynastic kings, Old, Middle and New Kingdoms, decentralized communities, Nakata, Badari, and others, prehistory, unknown periods, Shemisuhor, divine kings, unknown periods, demigods, unknown periods, gods, approximate timeline of ancient Egypt based on Turin Kings list, Manetho, and Greek historians King Horus followers, the demigods, and gods. Periods are just being ignored like they never existed. As we now have come to know that this papyrus was mentioned by respected Egyptologists like Dr. Salim Hassan, Dr. Ahmed Fakhri, and others, then clearly we're not just rambling on about an unknown or a secret papyrus here. But when they mention it, they did not tackle those ages, who lived in them, what were their achievements, and where did they go? They're just stating them as facts, full stop. There's a clear contradiction between the dates from Manetho, Turin Papyrus, and the current history books that shrink the Egyptian history into only 3,000 years of civilization, and attribute the pyramids, obelisks, temples, statues, and all other artifacts to only the dynastic period. It seems that all the considered dates set in the past 200 years by the early European Egyptologists were biased by religious beliefs. In other words, the age of the Egyptian civilization is not supposed to be more than 6,000 years old according to the biblical timeline. And if there were any differences in the true timeline, according to Manetho's followers, it might have happened due to either some calendar discrepancies or personal opinions. Inevitably, there are several periods in Egyptian history that we know absolutely nothing about, and that the true age of the Egyptian civilization is not 3,000 years old but exceeds tens of thousands of years old. All these pieces of information were in front of Robert Bauval whilst investigating the age of the pyramids. How clearly the age of the entire Egyptian civilization was not based on any solid evidence, and how our entire understanding of ancient Egypt has been restricted to only the dynastic period or just a little bit before it. In this case, it's quite possible that the age of the pyramids is older than 2500 BC, and that's why the angles are not mirrored. The constellation of Orion wasn't even facing the pyramids. Now let's return to the program and go even further back in time. We'll try to take it back to the prior 3500 B. C will face the sky from the south of the Giza pyramids and start going backward. Now there's a match. The Giza pyramids are indeed facing Orion's belt at a 45 degrees angle to the horizon, and the River Nile is also facing the Milky Way galaxy at an angle of 9 degrees, but the year is 10,500 B.C. 10500 B. C is the nearest possible date where there is mirroring between the Giza pyramids and Orion's belt. Bauval's friend Graham Hancock was with him during this experiment. He exclaimed to Bauval about the hardship they would be met with, just by stating the relationship between the pyramids and Orion's belt. How unfavorable would it be to state that the exact date of the pyramids is 10,500 B.C.? Maybe there's something wrong with this program's calculations. Let's try another program. It's the same result. Even with a third program, the result is always 10,500 BC. This means that the builders of the pyramids have indeed recorded its age in a way that cannot be falsified or eliminated. All things considered, ancient Egyptian history should be rewritten, since there is a clear indication that the age of ancient Egyptian civilization is several thousands of years earlier than the currently affirmed date. Furthermore, the builders of the pyramids are not necessarily from the dynastic period. They seem to be from a much older time, and the dynastic period could have been just like us, came while the pyramids were already history. The long story short is that the first time the pyramids matched Orion's belt and the River Nile matched the Milky Way was in 10500 B.C., which is the appropriate age for the pyramids. In 1994, Robert Bauval published his theory in his book The Orion Mystery, which had a huge buzz and was a bestseller in the UK at the time, but academic Egyptologists refused the theory and refused to even debate it. They accused Bauval of being ignorant, a fantasy lover, and an attention seeker. In several TV shows, Dr. Zahi Hawass refused to even discuss or debate the theory in detail. He mocked the author and stated that reading such a book was a pure waste of time. But with all due respect to Dr. Zahi Hawass, but how can one criticize a book they haven't read? We lost a lot behind this feud, and the debate turned into a personal refute. There aren't any known Egyptian books discussing this theory except Mr. Antoine Boutras's book Mystery of the Great Pyramid, in Arabic. If anyone is interested in going into depth in this theory, I recommend that you read this book. Mr. Antoine attributed the refusal of academics to this theory for two main reasons. Firstly, it's well agreed upon amongst Egyptologist scholars that the pyramids are a part of a religious belief related to the sun. The sides of the pyramids resemble the sun's rays, and the pyramids are platforms for takeoff to aid the king on his journey to the sun and join Orion on his journey using the sun boats. And the pyramids are built on the west bank of Th.